The history of the East India Company is a study of the relationship between commercial and imperial power. It looks at how corporations impact on politics and vice versa.
Hello and welcome to the 6th episode of Chicago Dialogue, Season 2. I'm Deepesh Chakravarti. I teach history and South Asian languages and civilizations at the University of Chicago. And I'm currently also the faculty director of the University of Chicago Center in Delhi. And this series, as you know, is produced by our Delhi Center in collaboration with prohor.in, and the best-selling author of a book on Darashuko, Avik Chanda, has been acting as the anchor for this series. Today, I welcome you to a wonderful episode where we're absolutely honored and thrilled to host the renowned writer and historian, William Dalrymple, in conversation with three of my esteemed colleagues, Sunit Singh, Stephen, we call him Steve, Pincus, and James Vaughan, who are also on the screen with us. Sunit will do the formal introducing of everybody. All I can say very briefly is I'm personally so delighted to have William, whose books on, well, the Anarchy, The Last Mughal, White Mughals, the City of Jinn. I mean, Jinns have been on our reading list in many courses. We discuss and debate them. And these are books that have had tremendous impact, both on academic writing of history as well as what I've elsewhere called the public life of history in India and elsewhere. And today, my colleague Steve Pincus will act as the moderator for this program. Stephen is the Thomas Donnelly Professor of History in the Department of History. He's the Professor of British History and the college. He has revolutionized the study of British Empire, at least the academic study of British Empire. And his book on the 1688 revolution has won many prizes. The only thing I might do by way of introducing him quickly is quote him on his approach to British Empire. And you will see what a revolutionary historian he is. And he says, I'm quoting Steve, I insist that accounts of the colonies that focus on the binary relationship between a particular colony and a set of colonies in Britain will necessarily misunderstand that relationship. The British Empire can only be understood as a global phenomenon. With that, and thanking my colleagues both at prohor.in and at the Delhi Center, I just conclude this brief introduction and my welcome to you all to the discussion that follows. And now, over to you, Sunit.
Thank you, Deepesh. I want to thank Avik and Suman and Lenny and Wendy Doniger, who first connected me to Will, and I want to thank everyone else for tuning in. A brief introduction to Will, who needs no introduction, but William Dalrymple is the best-selling author of the Wolfson Prize-winning White Mughals. He's also the author of The Last Mughal, which won the Duff Cooper Prize, the Hemingway and Kapuscinski Prize-winning Return of the King. His most recent book is The Anarchy, which we will discuss today, which was longlisted for the Bailey Gifford Prize in 2019. And was shortlisted for the Duke of Wellington Medal for Military History, the Tata Book of the Year, and the Historical Writers Association Book Award for 2020. It was also a finalist for the Cundhill Prize for History and won the 2020 Arthur Ross Medal from the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations. Will is the recipient of a handful of honorary doctorates, is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, the Royal Asiatic Society, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and has held visiting fellowships at Princeton, at Brown, and at Oxford. He writes regularly for the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, and the Guardian. In 2018, he was presented the prestigious President's Medal by the British Academy, and was named one of the world's top 50 thinkers for 2020 by Prospect. He is also the founder and co-director of the Jaipur Literary Festival. I'll be joined in conversation with Steve Pincus, who has been introduced already by Deepesh, but he is once again Thomas E. Donnelly Professor of British History at the University of Chicago, and author of 1688, the First Modern Revolution, which came out in 2011, and itself is won a number of prizes. He's presently completing a book on the global history of the British Empire. I'm also joined by my friend and colleague, James Vaughan, who himself is a historian of the East India Company and wrote a marvelous book, The Politics of Empire at the Accession of George III, the East India Company and the Crisis and Transformation of Britain's Imperial State, which came out in 2019, alongside Will's book, The Anarchy. And I am Suneet Singh. I teach in the college and actually teach a course on the East India Company. And I'm the co-director of the Social Sciences Writing Program here at the University of Chicago. Will, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
It's a huge honor and a great pleasure, particularly to meet James, because it sounds like our two books are sort of perfectly complementary to each other. They came out the same year. Mine very much focuses on the Mughal and the Indian background of the rise of the company, while his book focuses very much on the metropolitan side of things. And I think that the two read together would provide a wonderful whole.
Great. So can I just say, I mean, first of all, how excited I am to have William Dalrymple here to have this discussion. It's his 4 books on have been the source of discussion among students, both undergraduates and graduates for some time, and it's also really great to have Suneet and James, who are really sort of involved in sort of thinking about the 18th century broadly in South Asia, and as part of this discussion. I'm mostly going to just sort of moderate, but I thought maybe just to kick things off, I would ask in a sort of general question to William, which is just, I mean, reading The Anarchy, which is a delight no matter how one spins it. One of the remarkable things, I mean, I sort of thought about this as one of the first things I point out to students is how deft and important is the use of Persian source material, which is quite different from what most people who've written about these this subject or these subjects, that is to say, the making of the coming of the East India Company to South Asia. I'm wondering if you could tell us and sort of to talk to us a bit about what you see as the advantages of using the Persian sources. I mean, what do you see by using these Persian sources that previous scholars who focus mostly, to be honest, on English language sources or perhaps European sources from the Dutch East India Company, the French East India Company, what do you gain by using these Persian sources?
Well, I blush to answer that question in a University of Chicago seminar where Muzaffar Alam is the presiding genius. And Muzaffar, of course, has spent his entire life using rare Persian sources with incredible effect. And all of us have learned a huge amount from him. But I think as you say, most people who study 18th century, most people who study empire, mainly study the English sources. And that's as true of work coming out of India as it is work coming out of America or Britain or Europe. And it is simply astonishing how much unused primary material there is in archives all over South Asia, simply because obviously Persian, which was the language of government and of letters and of diplomacy in South Asia from the 12th century right up until the 19th century, is a language which is extinct here. And the particular forms of Persian which were used often sound very odd to a modern Persian ear, or slightly less odd to an Afghan ear. But they are basically an extinct language. And the number of people, even in Delhi is a city with 3 universities with major and important history departments, but the number of people that can easily read Mughal sources fluently are fewer and fewer each year. And I was incredibly lucky to work very closely with a remarkable scholar called Bruce Wannell on all 4 of my company books. Bruce lived in Iran for many years, then moved to Peshawar, and had one of those people that could pick up languages like most of us pick up COVID. He was a sort of spectacular, had every European language. He also, which I think probably was part of the same thing, he was a wonderful musician and could play anything with the same facility. And we used to go around places like Tonk, Patna, the National Archives in Delhi, but also the incredible amount of Persian material sitting in the British Library, the most obvious place of all. And we'd find that not only was most of it completely unused, that even the catalogue entries were often very misleading, and that we'd have to wade through pages of written sources and often find that the catalogue entry was completely wrong, and we'd be 100 years out when we actually got it into a manuscript. And one could spend weeks getting a manuscript out of a place like Tonk, which is very difficult to work in, and even more difficult to get permission to do photocopies or photographs in, and then find that in fact the contents are quite other than what you've been led to believe. But when you strike lucky, you can find incredible material that simply has never been looked at before. And of course, in a field like this, where it's increasingly rare to find even single documents that are both important and unread. To find whole libraries full of material that have simply not been looked at since they were put in the British Library or somewhere in some provincial library in India for 150 years ago. It is an unbelievable resource, and Bruce could translate this stuff as easily as most of us, can read the front page of the New York Times. He had a fantastic facility, but he didn't know the history, and we'd work through these manuscripts that we'd photocopied together. And Bruce, having completed the 4 books which make up this company quartet, died of cancer just after the publication of the Anarchy, and it's a huge loss because really I worked with many scholars and I've never met anyone that had a couple of people in Delhi, but very, very few people can can read this material as fluently as he could, and also he had a beautiful turn of phrase, and was an incredibly talented translator, and the translations he produced from the Ibratnama and so on are great works in themselves. So I'm very much I feel like, in a sense, that the door to Narnia has closed. I've locked out of the magic cupboard slightly since he left, and I've done something completely different over the last few years, just for a change. But that is, I mean, in a sense, I think if this book has any contribution at all, other than a pacey read, it is in those wonderful translations that Bruce has produced, and accessing really quite obscure documents from a variety of provincial libraries that simply haven't been looked at before. And hence, in a sense, the concentration on the Mughal background to the company. And this is very much the story of the rise of the company set against the decay of Mughal power. And I suppose the principal balance, the yin and yang of the book, if you like, is playing off Clive, who was such a astonishingly successful but ruthless and sort of brutal man in many ways. And Shah Alam, who was the opposite, who was enormously civilized, wrote poetry in 6 languages, good-looking, brave, honorable, and lost every battle he ever fought, and whose whole political life was a sort of spectacular tragedy and failure. And that trope, I think, is the central idea of the book, in the sense, the central spine of the book.
Right. That sounds perfect. That might be a good place to pivot to James Vaughan. Do you?
Well, first off, William, it's an honor to share a platform with you. I've been a huge fan of your work, not just in the Anarchy, but going back to the entire grand vision you presented of the rise and development of the British Empire on the Indian subcontinent during the 18th and 19th centuries. I wanted to ask you a question about the Anarchy, having both brilliantly analyzed and narrated the rise and development of the British East India Company from a commercial corporation to a territorial empire. I wanted to sort of maybe ask what historians would call a counterfactual question, but I would rather pose it as an imaginative one. And I think all historians of the East India Company have faced this at some point, which is, many European and South Asian voices at the time of the later 18th century thought that there was a possibility of a different relationship between Europe and Asia, more specifically between Britain and India. And were quite critical of what men like Clive were doing and the kind of early company Raj that was being put into place. And I guess I wanted to ask you, do you think those voices were utopian, meaning could it have been otherwise? And to say the same question in another way, was there a possibility not for a kind of autarky between Europe and Asia, but rather a different encounter between Britain and India, a different form of interdependence arising and developing?
What a lovely question. Yes, I do, actually. And my first book of these 4 books, White Moguls, is really a look at that. We have such a clear idea in our heads of what colonialism is all about, and particularly the British Empire, and instantly images of sort of Lord Curzon and guys in empire building shorts and solo topies having a slash at Indian protesters in white khaki in Connaught Place. And so much of the actual social history of the 18th century is so completely apart from that. And I came to this through I'd written in my very early 20s, just straight out of college, a book called City of Gins, which was a travel book rather than a history book. But in that, I tumbled down the rabbit hole of a family archive of my wife's family. I was looking at this character, William Fraser, who very much defied every idea of every stereotype of imperialism. He was a great patron of Ghalib. He collected Mughal miniatures. He wore Indian clothes. He got involved in Indian blood feuds. He had many Indian children, but had one particular wife in the end who he lived with in Haryana, and was a great patron of Ghulam Ali Khan and Mazhar Ali Khan, the great company school painters and painters of the late Mughal court. And was a man who Shah Waliullah described as the most interesting Farangi he'd ever met, and the only one who we give time to. From that, I went on to do White Mughals, because it turned out that this guy was not, a one-off, that there was a brief moment, really. It's got a moment between particularly sort of 1760 and about 1810, about sort of 50 years, when there were hundreds of these characters around. David Ochterlony, James Kirkpatrick in Hyderabad was the one I particularly focused on, who fell in love with South Asia and fell in love with South Asian women, had mixed race children, and lived very much the kind of lives that many people, with mixed race families lead today, and whose houses and private lives, mixed two worlds, where they were possibly sitting at a table but eating Indian food with their hands. The pictures of women, Indian women, sitting on European furniture, but smoking a hookah, wearing nose rings, and you get this impression of two worlds mixing as they do today, every day in any American university, in any multicultural town anywhere in the world. But it's not what we expect from imperialism. It's a very different image to what we expect from the colonial world, and. So yes, there was no necessary historical imperative that we would end up with the deeply extractive and exploitative and brutal form of colonialism that we did. The history of human interaction, has a whole variety of different forms of interaction between peoples, ranging from massacres and bloodshed and genocides through to, massive intermarriages and the fusions of culture. And the history of the British in India has, a variety of those different possibilities, ranging from harmonious interaction to outright genocide and mass murder. And any one of them, in a sense, could have been the main form of imperialism, as it was. Imperialism was deeply extractive and brutal, and the White Mughals lost, in a sense. But thank you. That's a lovely question, and yes, I do think that there were many possibilities when two different peoples meet.
Thank you.
Sinead? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if I may, William, well, build on sort of both Steve's question and James's in different ways. One is to ask about maybe the limitations of some of the Persian sources, given that they were written in a courtly milieu. And then to contrast that with the other side of the story that you tell quite remarkably in the Anarchy, of South Asians who were involved in the making of company rule in India, apart from the Jagat Seths who sort of bankrolled the Plassey Revolution. There were clearly merchants and others who took refuge in Calcutta, and not to mention, of course, the thousands who were enrolled as sepoys in the company army. What you make of sort of their role in the formation of the Raj?
Well, I think you're right. I think in a sense, the two main props to British rule were, on one hand, the initially small, but by the end, very, very large number of Indian sepoys who made up the East India Company forces. The figures are surprising for anyone that doesn't know this period of history. The British Army in 1799, when they were about to rearm to fight Napoleon, had 100,000 soldiers. The same year, the East India Company Army had 200,000 brown Indian sepoys who fought for a corporation. I don't think you can overemphasize what a strange bit of history this is. That you have Indian soldiers, mercenary soldiers, fighting for a corporation, the 18th century equivalent of Facebook or Google or ExxonMobil or any other great multinational corporation that spans continents and is incredibly powerful. And where's this money coming from? It's coming partly from, or by the end of the 18th century, coming from land revenue, which is gathered in great quantities by the East India Company, and increasingly effectively after the permanent settlement. But it's also gathered from, astonishingly, again, weirdly to our eyes, from readily gathered from Indian bankers. And this is something which, work has been done in academia, obviously, for 40 years, from Kumkum Chatterjee and Chris Bailey in the 80s, through to a whole range of other people since then. But I think it's still a surprise to most readers. Certainly, very few Indians brought up on nationalist textbooks imagine that their own bankers actually bankrolled the East India Company, less still the fact, which again is sort of astonishing to us all, really, in retrospect, that Plassey was a setup of a bunch of Marwari bankers who paid the East India Company to get rid of Siraj-ud-Dowlah. That's not how it's taught in school books, either in Britain when it was taught in British school books, or in Indian nationalist texts. But it is the fact. There's no getting away from this. They paid for Plassey, and both Mir Jafar and Clive were in there on their bankroll. So I think those are the two principal allies on the Indian side. But there's also, I think, after the permanent settlement, when so much of the old zamindari land is put up for auction, you get a whole new class of Hindu tradesmen who also become part of kind of the British support base. Families like the Debs, the Malik, the Tagores, who have done very well out of the breakup of the Moguls, and I don't want to sound like some sort of BJP politician, but clearly there's a lot of Hindu support for the British, often in opposition to the Mughals, and people do see the company as a viable alternative to Mughal rule. And it is the largely Hindu trading classes, and particularly the financiers and the bankers, who ally with the British. And I think, again, for anyone watching this who doesn't know this well, I mean, one can in a sense think of 18th century Calcutta a bit like Singapore or Dubai today. It's a place that has very low taxes, where you can escape from the heavy hand of government as a businessman, not in political terms, but as a businessman, and where businesses can flourish, which is why the Marwaris went there all the way from Rajasthan en masse at this time and took refuge there. And the question that's interesting is, why would a bunch of businessmen from the other side of India go and make their homes in a British settlement, particularly at a time when the British are aggressive and rude and racist, and there's a white town and a black town, and all sorts of very unpleasant things going on there. And the answer is that they make a profit from the company, and the company provides an environment which allows these financiers to flourish. And while they may loot and pillage and rape and do all sorts of unpleasant things, they repay their debts on time with interest and understand the meaning of financial contracts. And if you're a financier, that's a very important thing. In my last Mughal book, there's graphic descriptions of what happens to Indian financiers in Delhi in 1857. When the rebel armies go there, and they're literally hung upside down by their heels until they cough up their wealth. And the company understood that if you cultivated the bankers and the financiers and treated them well, they would lend to you. And by the end, you have them competing to join. In 1803, you have a whole lot of letters which Kumkum Chatterjee found and Lakshmi Subramaniam of the different bankers competing to finance the army and all wanting to be part of this. And why? Because they make a profit. And they see, and it's one group of financiers talking financially the same language as another group of financiers, and even though one not a vegetarian Jains from Rajasthan, and the others are sort of John Bull beef-eating Englishmen, at some level they understand each other, as that they can make a profit from each other, that they understand the business of interest rates and finance, and they form this alliance, and that's what creates the company rule.
Sunit, do you want to?
Well, I was going to simply push a little, Will, to ask, whether the story there looks a little bit different from that of the court chroniclers of Shah Alam and others, right? Whether that story would look, we don't have as many sources about those bankers, the sort of middle merchants who were invested in the advance of company rule. And there are clearly sort of disputes within the company as well. That would be, and those who were critical of the return of Clive when he returns in 1765 and the sort of monopoly state that forms. I wonder if you might address those.
Well, obviously, with Mughal sources, as with any historical source, you've got to use them critically and understand where they're coming from and sort of account for that. My favorite source in this book, although in a sense it's once been available to everybody for 200 years, is Ghulam Hussain Khan in the Siyama Takreed. And I feel that he's rather like sort of Edward Said from the other end of the telescope. Edward Said sitting in 1977 writing Orientalism just after colonialism is in its sort of death throes. It's just Mau and sort of Kenya is just sort of finishing off, and it's the last Gulf states are getting their independence, and he's writing about what colonialism looks like then. Ghulam Hussain Khan is his direct equivalent in 1780s Calcutta, realizing for the first time, the pennies dropping, what colonialism actually means for a man in his position. He's from a Mughal family, he's from a service family who've been cavalrymen for the Mughals. They've been given landed estates, they're mansabdars, and suddenly they're completely out of a job. They're completely screwed. The army these days is all about infantrymen. They want yeomen and Brahmins and Rajputs from Bihar and Awadh, and they have absolutely no use at all for Mughal cavalrymen who've been the privileged elite of the Mughal court. Not only that, he notices that the Brits are building classical buildings. They often want to import their own furniture from London. They don't want they have their own portrait painters. They don't need the court artists. They have very little interest in Indian dancing girls except for when the dance is over, and that whole world of incredibly elaborate Mughal court culture, which a man like Ghulam Hussain Khan has been brought up to valorize and think of as high culture, is over in a generation. Suddenly, it doesn't mean a thing. It's totally undermined and devalued. And so, I think he is a spectacular source, and one which I say, he was translated into English by this extraordinary character in this Greek living in Murshidabad in the 1780s, and it's been sitting there. And amazingly, I'm surprised it's used so little because it's such a good source. It's 4 volumes. It's incredibly detailed. It does all sorts of it's less useful if you're dealing with Tipu or something because he wasn't there. But he's right in the Murshidabad court. He's a cousin of Siraj Ad-Dawla. He knows all the court factions and the different begums and the different cousins, and it's spectacular. So I think, yes, of course, you've got to use Mughal court sources carefully as you have to use any source. But I think they're much undervalued and underused.
James, do you want to?
Yeah, William, I want to ask a question, and basically, your book, The Anarchy, reminds 21st century readers, or actually probably makes many 21st century readers aware for the first time of the absurdity in world historical terms of a commercial corporation, right, responsible for the short-term interests of its shareholders, ruling over a vastly populated subcontinent.
200 million people, yeah.
Yeah. And I was reviewing the book in preparation for our dialogue today, and just thinking, there's this 18th century expression about the Prussian state, that it's not a country with an army, but an army with a country. And what your book makes clear is that this is a commercial corporation, and shareholders that have a bureaucracy, that has an army, that has a country. and the complete absurdity of that. And I want to pose to you, because I was wondering which side of this, because I can see material in your book for you falling on either side of this. So I'd like to ask, there's sort of going back to observers of the first century of the company Raj before it becomes the Crown Raj, all the way from, say, Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations to Karl Marx's writings on the British Empire in India. There's been kind of two positions. One position that this is all just haphazard, right? A lot of just kind of purely empirical historians like to take that view, that it just, this haphazard circumstance, this is uncontrollable, unforeseen contingency, and this entire, motley crew of British imperial rule where nobody knows who's responsible to anybody else, shareholders and a board and a bureaucracy and an army and zemindars, that this is all just, completely contingent and accidental. And then there are those like Adam Smith and then later Karl Marx who sort of argue, no, this whole thing serves a series of interests. It's not that it's, a cabal has designed it exactly, but rather that there are a series of social and political interests that are definitely served. And behind all of this is a very, politically autocratic and economically extractive project that is serving some people in South Asia and some people in the metropole in Britain. And they, they may not have designed this, but they're very happy with the way it works, right? With the way the world is. And I'm wondering where you would fall in that kind of opposition.
Well, I know where you fall on this one, and I've much enjoyed reading you on this, and I'm very, very interested in your answer to that question, which you must give after I've done mine. But I think it's such a complicated and long story. I mean, the East India Company starts at the time of Shakespeare, and it's still there by the time of Burke and Hastings, and then right into the mid 19th century. And it's different things at different times. I mean, it's completely different things at different times. But I think a lot of the stuff in the crucial period of the 1750s and 60s is reactive. Plassey is not planned. First of all, I mean, there's a whole series of Kolkata. First of all, there's a misunderstanding about a French fleet, and Clive is sent out to India to go and chase the French fleet that, in fact, has gone off to Canada. So he arrives in Madras without anything to do, and then thank God for him. Suddenly, the news of the fall of Calcutta comes, and he can go off and make his name. And then he's about to go home, and he writes to his dad saying he's retaking Calcutta. He's off back to Madras, and then the Jagat Sets come with this opportunity to turn him into the richest man in Europe if he pulls off what he does. And of course, he grabs it without really particularly checking with anyone. And then the 7-Year War breaks out at the same time, almost the same day that the letter arrives from the Jagat Sets. So a whole lot of contingent things happen that no one had planned. And you cannot see that as part of a conspiracy. It's quite clearly a series of sort of bizarre historical accidents. It's very another interesting kind of factor. What would have happened if Clive had not been there? He was there due to, rather like the entire Iraq War was caused by a misreading of intelligence about yellow cake, and was manipulated, and so you end up in the invasion of Iraq, which obviously had nothing to do with 9/11. In the same way, a whole series of mistakes of the reading of a piece of intelligence about a French fleet loading up in Port Royal leads to an entire company fleet, a Royal Navy fleet, going off the other end of the world after a phantom enemy that doesn't exist. You cannot see this as part of a conspiracy to create empire. And ditto, the whole chain of conflict that leads up to the Battle of Buxar in 1765. There's some incredibly unpleasant British factors in Patna, Ellis and Bolt and so on, misbehaving in Patna, getting into conflict with Mir Qasim. And again, this is unplanned. Neither side has planned for this conflict, which suddenly erupts in Patna. and Mir Qasim takes the initiative, and again, bizarrely, then suddenly by the Battle of Buxar, which again is very nearly lost, and is a very close call. The company suddenly finds itself in charge of the entire Gangetic Plain, not just Bengal, not just Orissa and Bihar, but all the way up to the Rohilla territories in sort of Rampur area, and they don't really know what to do with it. They had no one had, and if you look at the whole business of giving Shah Alam Allahabad and that whole business, that was planned by Clive the night before. There'd been no plan to give Shah Alam anything. The question was whether to take over Shuja's territory and take over Awadh or not. And in the end, it's Janti, I think, who persuades Clive to give a role to Shuja-ud-Dawla and get him to surrender. But again, so I'm giving you a complicated and long-winded answer, but it's a whole series of accidents at the beginning, and I don't want to sound like Seeley, and I know you strongly disagree with it, with the whole idea that there's a fit of absence of mind, but equally, there's no way you can possibly see that think there's a master plan, and so it's very much the cock-up theory of history rather than the conspiracy, in my view, in that crucial moment, if you're looking at particularly at that moment between 1756 and 1765, which is the crucial decade when everything changes and can never go back.
Do either of you want to?
Well, I wonder about that. I mean, now that you've raised the 17th...
I certainly expect James to challenge that. Come on, James.
Sunit, I'm happy to follow up your question. I can follow up Sunit's question.
Well, I mean, the 50s and 60s, I mean, I feel like James stepping on your toes, right? But when Clive returns to India, I mean, what do you make of sort of the fact that the company turned down the Divani on at least 2 or 3 different occasions before it accepts it in 1765. I mean, I take your point about the importance of Buxar and that victory, that it wasn't inexorable sort of from Plassey to Buxar, that there would be a company state in the form that it took. But what do you make of the sort of the metropolitan kind of story of how there are ministries that are involved in the East India Company elections in 64 and 63 and 64 that alter dynamics quite significantly?
James, you should answer that. This is your baby.
I would just say, and this is not in some kind of diplomacy, I think what you had said earlier, William, about a certain compatibility between 2 different stories is true. That is, I think that the idea that there is a plan for the company's rise to military and political supremacy in northeastern India is absurd. I mean, I don't think anybody could seriously suggest that the story that you just laid out is not true. Meaning, I think it's incredibly contingent, unforeseen, unplanned, and your word, reactive. My only response, and I guess I'd be interested to hear your response to this, would be no reaction dictates a response. And I think that it's like saying the financial crisis no one planned, but the series of austerity policies that were pursued afterwards were not inevitable like the weather, right? That they were political and there was a debate and one side won and one side lost. And I guess what I would put to you is I just think that there are versions of, your white moguls, right? That there are people both in South Asia and in Britain who see what's happening and are aware of this rise to supremacy and are trying to bring the reading public aware of it and say, listen, this is there's an empire coming and it's taking a certain shape and it might take another shape. But they're defeated by people like Clive and people like Lord North. And so so in other words, I accept completely that the possibility of empire is unplanned, unforeseen. Where I disagree, and I'm not sure if you would share this position, I didn't take you to share Sheely's position actually, is that there's then a politicization, there's a debate, there's a discussion as to what form the empire should take, and certain sides win out. And I guess I would just put the point that the fact that a certain kind of company Raj is reproduced over time in a certain kind of way, despite all of the attempts to reform it or the criticisms of it, at least suggests to me that it serves certain social and political interests, if you will, in Britain itself over time. But again, I'm not claiming that this in any way means that there was a plan in, say, the 1750s to create a company Raj that would last a century, if that makes sense.
I think this is where we started this conversation by saying that in a sense your book and my book are very nice echoes of each other. My book tells the story of those weirdly improbable series of events that leads to suddenly in 1765 the company controlling all the richest area of India. And then, as you have shown in your work, there's a whole lot of readjustment to take place in London to get Clive's position in a sense reinforced, and the whole politicking that goes on with Sullivan and so on takes place in London and creates space for what emerges, which, as you say, serves very specific interests and is one particular vision of empire which may never have happened in a slightly different fall of the dice.
Can I just, and
then the old cliche, which I know is one that people get bored of, but there is, I think it's very important to emphasize, and I do think it's true, that you have, if you are a British officer in India, and you basically have 20 years to make your fortune or not, or die. War is very good for you. And particularly in a world where you have prize, which again, for anyone watching that doesn't understand what that means, it means that if you take a city violently and it resists, you have the right to loot it. And that's as true of Indian armies as it is of European armies. And a single big success, like taking Tipu's capital at Srirangapatnam in 1799, enriches an entire generation of soldiers. Everyone comes home with a gold tiger in their pocket, and if you're Lord Wellesley or Harris or Baird, you come home with a landed estate and half of Scotland. And so it's hugely in your interest to have war. While, and again, this is a cliche, but, there is generations of letters coming out of Leadenhall Street saying we want a peaceful trade. And there's never a peaceful trade. It's always war, of course. These guys need to make their loot and get home before they die.
So could I just ask a little follow-up? Not really, because I sort of defer to both of your expertise on this particular thing, but it did strike me, reading the Anarchy and reading it sort of alongside other accounts of things going on in the British Empire contemporaneously elsewhere. What struck me as, intriguing is the story that's told here is a story about, a company that's too big to fail, a company which does things, which, to the perspective of anybody sort of on the ground in South Asia, that is to say, who isn't benefiting financially in the ways that you describe, might seem, irrational, cruel in a variety of ways. But it's a story very much in which the British imperial state, that is to say, is largely absent, right? It's the East India Company given a relatively free hand. But the contrast with the sort of standard accounts of the American Revolution, where the revolution, the standard accounts, I'm not endorsing them, I'm just saying this is what most people say, is that,
is George III personally waging war?
Is that the state gets too big, too mean, etc., and Americans want, and there's a similar sort of story really about the West Indies, right? that what ends up happening, whatever was going on the ground in the West Indies, it was the imperial state that put down slave rebellions, et cetera, which therefore shaped the direction of these things until the state decides that slavery is a bad thing and they get rid of it and then shapes it in a different way. So I guess what I'm sort of wondering is, how do we account for the increasingly strong presence of the imperial state in the Western Hemisphere at the same moment that you get, an East India Company which is sort of left to do things on its own in South Asia?
Well, obviously, as I said, there are different East India Companies at different times, and obviously the East India Company post 1774, and again after 1784, is a very different East India Company to the one we have in 1756 or 1765. What I'd love to do is back a question to you, Steve, because I don't know this stuff. I used in the Anarchy 2 essays by Emma Rothschild about how much the patriots sitting in Boston are fearing, are reading all the accounts of the Bengal famine and all the horror stories coming out of India, and are very fearful that the company might be let loose, and hence it's East India Company tea, which is shoved into Boston Harbor. How much is that actually important in the American Revolution? Is it a big deal, or is it a minor part of the story?
Oh, I think it's a big deal. I think it's a big deal precisely because, the discussion, for example, in The Alarm, which was the set of essays that really criticized the Bengal famine in North America, see the East India Company as an agent of the British state. So it's absolutely right to say what you point out, that they're worried that the East India Company is going to be let loose in North America, but they see that as part of the state, that this is this rapacious, extractive state. So there's no question. I was struck too. What Emma says and what you say is absolutely right. And in fact, if anything, I was surprised by going through North American newspapers and West Indian newspapers how much they knew about the famine. And how concerned they were about it and what it said about British imperial rule.
Does that make it into historiography of the American Revolution? Do many accounts of it contain this East India Company element?
No, not yet. James, you're working in this area now. I don't. My sense is that if you were to ask most, both most educated readers who consume the material on the American Revolution and most scholars working in the field, I don't think the story about the Bengal famine and the East India Company looms large in their accounts. The Boston Tea Party, absolutely, but the Boston Tea Party is usually described as another way in which North Americans were reacting to what the British state was doing.
That's really exciting. I often, particularly when I've been giving talks to American audiences, I've been quoting this stuff, but I've been very worried that I'm talking bullshit. This isn't true. I don't know this American history at all. I'm very ignorant of it.
So he says that given that there were so many wars, big and small, in the 18th century that were funded by different banking families that were in turn often given land for security, was there a process underway for bankers to become landlords, a process that somehow got interrupted by the rise of British rule?
I don't know the detail of that. The person the work to turn to is Kumkum Chatterjee and Lakshmi Subramaniam's brilliant work on this, and then later Chris Bailey, which has very detailed studies of these banking families. My impression is that a lot of these families have developed under Mughal and late Mughal rulers and are adapting to the changing conditions by allying to the company. And again, it's very accidental process, but in the end, they see that the company is as simply more reliable as they pay their debts quicker. I don't know any cases of the company offering estates as such to banking families. I think they're commercial contracts with cash rather than being offered old-style landed estates or zamindaris or so on. But I'm really not qualified to answer that detailed question about the banking families. So there's a lot of very, very good work on this, which Kumkum's work in particular is fantastically detailed, and on the Patna banking families.
Right, and so there's a question from the audience, which is says, seeing as how the corporation has taken over the world since the days of the East India Company, do you think that there is something inherent which connects corporate interest with wars?
A nice question.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what I love about this whole weird story of a corporation taking over the richest country in the world, then, is the way that it you can, I think, generally say this is, all the things that the East India Company is doing is the first time a corporation has done this. It is the first great multinational, which is there are earlier corporations, but none have had this sort of cross-continental power that the East India Company soon develops. And all the things that we fear in corporations today, for example, the way that corporations can corrupt and alter the course of domestic politics by campaign donations, or simply giving wads of cash in envelopes, which the director of the East India Company in 1690 has put in the Tower of London for that, the first ever case of corporate corruption, where cash is given to MPs to get them to change their vote, in this case to extend the monopoly of the company. And this whole world of corporate lobbying that exists in India, the whole question of Adani and Reliance and their links to the rise of the BJP, the whole question of ExxonMobil and the Iraq War, all these things that we deal with across the world as corporations altering politics, goes back to the East India Company. This is the first time it happens. And when you study the company, you get to see the roots of this. There are certainly cases where corporations bring about wars. I mean, the whole history of the East India Company with its own army is a story in itself. But you see it, I suppose in the 20th century, look at 1956 in Iran with the fall of Mossadegh. And that's the Anglo-Persian Oil Company persuading the CIA and the MI6 to bring down Mossadegh and put in the Shah. A few years later in Guatemala, where they're about to nationalize United Fruits territory, and there's a coup d'etat, and the socialist government is sacked, and you get the phrase "banana republic" for the first time. Then 1977 in Chile, where ITT gets the CIA to get rid of Allende, and you end up with one of the nastiest juntas in Latin American history. So this idea of a corporation interfering with countries and bringing down governments, it's something that we do see today, and still to this day, we don't really know whether the role of the different oil companies in diverting the post 9/11 response to Iraq, rather than say to Saudi Arabia, or where all the 9/11 plotters were, was that another example of this. So I'm very excited by the way that, in a sense, what you're seeing in these, what look like old fusty history book things, the Battle of Plassey, is in fact the roots of all these things we see subsequently, right up to the Iraq War.
Great. I mean, in many ways, I must say, just sort of, your response, William, is a brilliant also counterpoint to what's become a sort of fashionable story told by economists now about outsourcing empire, that it was a good idea to sort of have these companies run these multinational corporations because it sort of meant it much more economically efficient. So I think that was a brilliant sort of counterpoint to that story. So I have a final question that, not from me, but from the audience, which is why do you think the history of the Bengal famine is somewhat ignored in British history? Can you elaborate on how colonizers create history?
Yeah, no, we don't. I mean, I did learn about the Irish potato famine, just about in my case, but I certainly didn't learn about the Bengal famine. No, I mean, obviously, the colonizers' textbooks contain very few imperial atrocities. You can go, or even now, you can go all the way through a British history education, and even to A level and even university level, without ever encountering the British Empire at all. Never mind the Bengal famine. I mean, you get a tiny bit of the impression you move from the Tudors to the liberation of the slaves. Then you get Florence Nightingale, then you get Hitler, and on all sides, the Brits are always on the side of the liberators. They're saving people from slavery and the servitude, and British values means freedom. I mean, I think people find it very hard to believe what is true, that the British don't teach their empire. There are individual history teachers who choose to do it. And it's in all our interests as historians of empire to lobby to get this absolutely into the heart of the curriculum, so everyone buys our books and we can retire and stop writing them. But at the moment, this is not in the history curriculum, and it's ignored. It's astonishing. But no, it's not surprising in that I don't think any nation goes out of its way to teach the bad stuff. I don't think the Israelis, big up the Nakba. I don't think we have massive courses on Mau Mau. The one exception to that probably is post 1945 Germany, which does teach the Holocaust and in a big way.
Great. So I think Deepesh is now going to sort of come on and summarize things. There he is.
I'm not summarizing things. It was a wonderful discussion. Just wanted to thank you all. First of all, William, for agreeing to come on this show, and my three wonderful colleagues, Sunit and James and Steve, for joining you in this conversation, to Abhik and the team at proher.com for offering us the platform that we use, and to my colleagues Leni and Suman and Arvind at the Delhi Center and others for making all of this possible. This just goes to show what a wonderful opportunity this episode, the dialogue series could be, and I just wish more of my colleagues would do this kind of conversations, stream. And thank you all, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah.
Thank you.
This was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. This was
Thank
fun.
you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.